This video is part of a series of videos dealing with Jewish life cycle events, and the subject of this video is death and mourning. Now, in terms of death and mourning in Judaism, in this video I want to talk about two things. First, I want to talk about the various customs and practices associated with death and mourning in Judaism. And second, I want to talk about a very special prayer that a mourner recites in Judaism called the Kaddish, the mourner's Kaddish. So, in terms of customs and practices associated with death and mourning in Judaism, first I want to point out that in talking about mourning, we're talking about the death of a loved one, a close relative, meaning a parent, child, sibling, or spouse. Okay. Second, most of the practices, ritual practices that are associated with death and mourning in Judaism are in the main matters of custom and not law. Most of the practices are matters of custom. And there are many, many customs relating to death and mourning in Judaism, so I'm only going to touch upon what I think are some of the most important customs and practices. So immediately upon hearing of the death of a loved one, again we're speaking of a parent, child, sibling, or spouse. So immediately upon hearing of the death of a loved one, in Judaism we do two things. We tear a piece of our clothing, generally it's the shirt above the heart, we tear clothing, and we say a blessing that comes from the Talmud, in Hebrew, Baruch Dayan Ha'emet, blessed is the true judge. So I want to say some words about each of these two things. So in terms of the tearing of the clothing, I want to point out that there's a biblical law. It's found in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 14, verse 1. And there it says, in Hebrew, lo titgodedu, which means not to cut yourselves. Do not cut yourselves. And this is evidently referring to an ancient pagan practice in the surrounding pagan cultures, surrounding the Israelite culture. There was evidently a widespread practice that there are still today some cultures in which this practice can be found, but it was an ancient pagan practice in which in a time of mourning, the mourner would cut himself or herself. To cut so that there was blood that would flow, so that the mourner is causing pain to himself or herself as an expression of grief. And the Bible then evidently objects to such a practice and says that we're not to cut ourselves. So we tear a piece of clothing as an expression of mourning, of our grief, but we do not cut ourselves. And in terms of this law, not to cut ourselves, I also want to say parenthetically that blood is symbolic in the Jewish tradition of life. And there's a concept in Judaism that has biblical roots, a concept of purity, purity and impurity. Sometimes it's translated in English as cleanliness and uncleanliness, but it's if it's translated as cleanliness, it's not cleanliness of a physical nature. This is a spiritual concept of purity, cleanliness, impurity, uncleanliness from a spiritual point of view. And the great example of impurity is death. And so also the great sin, I think, in the Bible, in the Jewish tradition, the great sin is the shedding of blood, especially the shedding of blood of another human being, murder, but also the shedding of our own blood, suicide, is forbidden in Judaism. This is the great sin in Judaism, is the shedding of blood. And blood is symbolic of life. And death, then, is the great example of impurity, ritual impurity. So, for example, the woman's menstrual cycle is seen as impure. The woman is seen as impure during her menstrual cycle. Why? She's seen as impure, unclean, not in a physical sense, in a spiritual sense, because she's losing blood, and blood is a source of life. So that in her menstrual cycle, she is, in the loss of her blood, she's losing a potential life. There's a potential life there that's lost. And so in that sense, she's seen as impure during her menstrual cycle. Okay. But to go back then to the Bible is preoccupied with life and not death. So that death is the great symbol in the Jewish tradition of impurity, ritual impurity, and the Bible is preoccupied with life to such an extent that there's actually no concept of an afterlife in Judaism, of life after death. The concept of an afterlife is a central concept in the rabbinic tradition. The term in the rabbinic tradition is olam haba, meaning the next world. This is a central concept in the rabbinic tradition. The concept, the term, olam haba, the next world, is not to be found in the Bible. The Bible, there's hardly any talk at all whatsoever in the Bible, hardly any talk of life after death. The Bible is preoccupied with life in this world. And the emphasis in the Bible is on making this a better world. And a central concept of the Bible, it's a central concept of the Jewish tradition having roots in the Bible, in the opening account of creation, is the concept of tikkun olam, repair of the world, that we learn from the opening account of creation, when God looks over all of the creation on the sixth day and says, "Behold, it is very good." The world is seen as very good, not evil, not sinful. The material, physical world is seen as good, very good, but it's in need of repair. It's in need of fixing. It's not a perfect world. And the human being created in the image of God is to be a partner in the creation. The human being created in the image of God is the only animal who has the power to transform nature, to transform what's God-given, to take wheat and to make it into something even better, bread. And we're to use then that power, created in the image of God, the human being is to use that power to transform nature, to improve the world, to fix the world, to overcome hatred, injustice, and cruelty in the world, to use our science and technology to improve the quality of human life. So that the emphasis in the Bible is entirely on this world. And this is a reaction to ancient Egypt. That in the ancient Egyptian civilization, that was a dominant civilization in the ancient biblical period. The ancient Egyptian civilization was a civilization preoccupied with death and dying. The pyramids were monuments to the dead, that the Egyptians were willing to enslave people, not just Hebrews, the ancestors of the Jewish people, but the Egyptians enslaved Hebrews and others as well, enslaved, oppressed people, in order to build monuments to the dead. So that the Bible, as a reaction to the civilization of ancient Egypt, is preoccupied with life, making this a better world. And the very name of God in Judaism, the unpronounceable name that we don't know how it was pronounced and we don't pronounce the name, is the name, the Hebrew letters in English, YHVH. And this great unpronounceable name, YHVH, comes from a Hebrew word, a Hebrew root, lihiot, which means to be, the opposite of death, to be, to exist, to live. And so that the entire emphasis in the Bible is making this a better world, and very little talk of an afterlife. So to go back then to this command not to cut ourselves. We're not to cut ourselves to cause pain to ourselves in a time of mourning, but we do tear the clothing. A piece of clothing is an expression of our grief, and then we say this blessing, Baruch Dayan Ha'emet, blessed is the true judge. And the image here of God, reflected in this blessing, blessed is the true judge. The image of God is as of a judge who's imposed a harsh judgment upon us. And just as in a court of law, if a judge imposes a harsh judgment upon us, we may feel that that judgment is unfair, we may feel it's unjust, we may be very disappointed. We'll have experience a variety of feelings, of anger, sadness, but we have to accept the judgment of the judge that is imposed upon us. As a matter of respect for the power and authority of the judge, we respect the judgment that is imposed upon us. And so the image here, upon the death of a loved one, we'll say, blessed is the true judge. The image is of God as a judge who's imposed a harsh judgment upon us that we're going to accept with a joyful heart. And what we mean by a joyful heart here is not that we're going to sing and dance. Even though there is such an idea in the Jewish tradition, it's not the mainstream of the Jewish tradition. Rabbi Nachman of Breslov was a great Hasidic teacher. The Hasidism is a form of Jewish mysticism that emerged in Eastern Europe in the 18th century. Rabbi Nachman lived in the 19th century. And Rabbi Nachman instructed his students that at his funeral they should sing and dance. That's not a mainstream position in the Jewish tradition. I think Judaism, in terms of ritual practice, often seeks out like a middle ground, kind of moderate position between extremes. So in the case here of death and mourning, especially in the death of a loved one, we again don't cut ourselves and cause pain and grief to ourselves. We tear a piece of clothing expressing our grief. During the mourning practices, we express our grief. Again, we may have many different kinds of feelings: sadness, anger, grief. We express our grief and our feelings, but we don't. On the one hand, we don't sing and dance. On the other hand, we don't cause harm to ourselves as an expression of our grief. We seek out a middle ground position, which we express our grief, but in saying, immediately upon the death of a loved one, saying, blessed is the true judge, we're accepting the judgment upon us, this decree upon us, that even though we may be sad, angry, we're in grief, we're accepting the judgment with a joyful heart. Again, doesn't mean we're going to sing and dance. It means we're going to reconcile ourselves with the heavens. We're going to continue living. That even with our feelings that may be difficult for us, anger, sadness, grief, a variety of feelings that we're experiencing upon the death of a loved one, we're going to continue living. We're not going to allow ourselves to fall into a depression or a despair. That's what's meant by the blessing, blessed is the true judge. Okay? So that's what we do upon immediately hearing of the death of a loved one, the tearing of the clothing, about the heart generally, and saying the blessing, blessed is the true judge. And then at the funeral, we begin to say this prayer that I'll come to, the Kaddish. The mourner says the prayer Kaddish, and following that, the mourner will say this prayer, the Kaddish, for a period of, for parents, it'll be a period of a year. For other loved ones, spouse, sibling, or child, it will be a period of a month. For parents, a period of a year that will say this prayer of the Kaddish. So after the funeral, there's a period of mourning of a week that's a more severe period, and that's called Shiva, from the Hebrew word for 7 days, that we sit Shiva. We sit for 7 days. We're to sit on the ground at home, on the ground or on a low stool as an expression of our mourning. And we're not to be preoccupied with our day-to-day living, to the point that we're not to cook, that people are to bring us food, people are to come and to comfort us while we're in our mourning during this period of a week, that we're sitting on the ground or on a low stool. And by the way, those who come to comfort a mourner, I think that means that we're in the main to listen. We're not to be giving advice, not to, the general rule is that we're not to speak to the mourner unless spoken to by the mourner. In the main, we want to listen and comfort the mourner. But this is also a period then, this period of a week of mourning is a period of, I think that's meant to be a time of self-examination, that in the face of death, the death of a loved one, we want to examine our own lives. I think one of the tragedies of the human condition is that we really appreciate people, and especially loved ones, not only loved ones, but people in general. We appreciate people after the person has died. And when the person is alive, oftentimes we have a tendency to portray other people, including loved ones, to portray people in a negative light, and to complain, and to find fault with others. And so that in this time of mourning, when we're sitting on the floor or on a low stool for a week following the funeral of a loved one, we're examining. It's a time of self-examination. And self-examination doesn't mean we're going to beat ourselves over the way that we may have related to this loved one. We may not have appreciated this person enough. We're not to beat ourselves. It's a time of self-examination, to examine what we could have, how we did relate to this person, what we could have done differently in order to learn and grow as a human being. And to use this as an opportunity to learn and to grow. And so that it should also influence us in our relationships with those of our loved ones and others who are still alive in our lives. And also self-examination in terms of, in the face of death of a loved one, in terms of what's really important in life. Also, something that's characteristic of the human condition is how much time we waste on very superficial and trivial things. And this is a time then that's fitting, by the time that we're in the face of death, and we're sitting on the ground during the week after the death of a loved one, we're sitting on the ground or a low stool, that we examine what's really important to us in life. So this is then in terms of the customs associated. I think these are the most important customs in my mind associated with death and dying. Again, following the week of the Shiva, that we sit at home on the ground or on a low stool. After the 7 days we get up, we return to our normal life, and then we have a less severe period of, again, if it's a parent, it's a period of a year that we're still in mourning. For a spouse, sibling, or a child, it's a period of a month. And it's during that time that we continue to say the prayer of the Kaddish as a mourner. And we generally avoid happy occasions or celebrations or hearing happy music, things to continue to, by the way of custom, again, to express our mourning. Okay, so that's in terms of customs. So now to the special prayer, the Kaddish. This is a special prayer that's in ancient Aramaic. I'm not going to read the prayer. You can look on Google and you'll find material on the prayer, and you'll find versions of the prayer. It actually has 4 versions, the prayer, in ancient Aramaic. Aramaic is, during the Talmudic period, became the spoken language of the Jewish people on a widespread basis. And it's a sister language of Hebrew. It's a Semitic language together with Hebrew, Arabic. And so the prayer Kaddish is written in Aramaic. And there are actually 4 versions that are a part of our synagogue service, a part of the traditional Jewish prayer book. And each of these 4 versions has a different function during the synagogue service. and they're all, again, very similar. They're variations of one basic prayer, but one of these 4 versions is called the Mourner's Kaddish, that's recited by mourners. So the Mourner's Kaddish, then, is a prayer that, according to Jewish law, is to be recited only in a quorum. This is what we call a minyan of 10 Jewish males. It's not to be said alone. So it's said only in a quorum, a minyan of 10 Jewish males, either in the synagogue. It can also be said at home during the period of the Shiva, of the 7 days. But it's said only with a minyan, a quorum of 10 Jewish males. By the way, women are not prohibited from saying the Kaddish as mourners. Women have been excluded by way of custom. By way of custom, it's generally men in traditional Judaism who have said the Kaddish, but women are not prohibited, and there have been cases of women who have recited the Kaddish. So, in any case, what I want to do now is to talk about why we say the Kaddish, and what the words are saying in general, even though I'm not going to actually read the prayer, in terms of the themes of the prayer. And these 2 questions are related. I think the question of why we're saying it is connected to the words, or should be connected to the words. So first of all, in terms of why we say the prayer, there's a widespread custom not a widespread custom, a widespread folk belief as to why we have the custom of saying the Kaddish upon the death of a loved one. And this folk belief is that we say the Kaddish, the mourner's Kaddish, for what's called in Hebrew, Iluya Neshama, the raising of the soul, the elevating of the soul of the deceased. Okay? And in my mind, that's not a very good explanation for 2 reasons. Number 1, and it's the second reason that's the more serious reason. But the first reason is a philosophic reason why I think this is not a good explanation. Because from a philosophic point of view, this explanation assumes that there is such a thing as a soul and an afterlife, which cannot be demonstrated from a scientific point of view. These are religious concepts: soul, afterlife. And there may be Jews of a secular background, a non-religious background, who don't relate to such religious ideas of a soul and an afterlife. And in my view, the prayer can still have great significance also for a secular Jew who may not even believe in God. This prayer, I think, can be significant, and if this is the explanation, that it's for the raising of the soul of the deceased after death, that may not, such an explanation is not relevant to, or will not speak to all Jews across the spectrum from secular to religious. So I think an explanation of the practice needs to be an explanation that's relevant to the entire Jewish people. So the second reason, I think this is not a good explanation, is that the prayer doesn't talk at all about death and dying, an afterlife, a soul, nothing whatsoever about death in this prayer Kaddish that a mourner recites in Judaism. Nothing about death, nothing about a soul or an afterlife. So that leads me to the second question, and what is the prayer talking about? And in here, in talking about what the prayer actually is talking about, I'll suggest then that the reason, I want to suggest then that the reason that we say this prayer is not for the sake of the deceased. It's not a philosophic reason or a theological reason. The reason that I want to suggest is a psychological reason, that we're saying it for our own sake. And actually what we're saying in reciting this prayer is, in one phrase, the very same blessing that we say upon hearing of the death of a loved one: blessed is the true judge. Blessed is the true judge. That again, we're accepting the judgment upon us that that may be difficult, the death of a loved one. We're accepting this as if it's a judgment from a judge, God, and we're accepting it upon us with a joyful heart, which again doesn't mean we're going to sing and dance. It means we're going to reconcile ourselves with the heavens, and we're going to continue living. So that this applies even in the case, even in the case of a secular Jew who may not believe in God. One of the terms for God in the Jewish tradition is Elohim, which is the side that's associated God, the side of God that's associated with nature, creation. And Elohim in Gematria, Hebrew letters have a numerical value, and Hebrew words have a value based on the sum total of the letters of the word. Elohim in Gematria is 86, and nature in Hebrew, Ha-Teva, is 86. God is the source of nature, the source of life. So nature 86, God 86. To me, the theology is not so important. Whether one sees the death of a loved one as a decree imposed upon us from a judge, from God conceived as a judge, Elohim 86, or we see it as something that's been imposed upon us by life. It's also 86, nature, 86. Whether it's imposed by God, by life, we're dealing with unwanted reality, something that we didn't want, something that's happened to us. And by saying, blessed is the true judge, we're reconciling ourselves with the heavens, that we're going to continue living. We're going to see this not as a problem, but an opportunity. The cup half filled with water, we're going to see as half full and not half empty. Opportunities and problems don't exist in life. There are no such thing as opportunities and problems. Opportunities and problems are perspective. To see a problem is to see life as half empty. And if we see a problem, we're going to have negative feelings of sadness, anger, disappointment, upset. If we see the very same situation as an opportunity, even the death of a loved one can be an opportunity again for us to grow through a process of self-examination in the face of death. And if we see the same situations as an opportunity, if the cup half full, then we're going to feel, we may again in the face of unwanted reality, the death of a loved one, we're not going to sing and dance, but we're going to reconcile ourselves with the heavens. We're not going to allow ourselves to fall into a despair or depression by seeing this as an opportunity for us to grow and to learn from, and to develop from such a situation, learning to deal with life's adversity and life's difficulties that are a part of life. Death is a part of life. There can be no life without death and no death without life. And in fact, there's a rabbinic teaching, a Talmudic teaching, that when God says, behold, it is very good, that includes death. It's a part, and that's what the rabbis there are saying, is not that the death of a loved one is something good, but it's a part of life that we have to reconcile ourselves and continue living. So that in the Kaddish, the two main themes of the prayer, and with this I'll finish on death and mourning, the two main themes are that we're expressing our hope for redemption for all human beings in the face of death, that we're reciting this prayer. It expresses a hope for redemption for all human beings, which then, in saying this upon the death of a loved one, we're broadening our perspective, that there are also many, many others. This is a part of life suffering, that we all suffer. There are those who may suffer even at least as much, if not more than us. And broadening our perspective allows us also to help to deal with our own personal suffering, and so that we're expressing our hope for redemption for all human beings, for peace and redemption. And then secondly, we're praising God, and the image of God in the prayer is a king. Again, like the blessing, blessed is the true judge, king, that we're accepting the decree upon us of the king or the judge, that it means that we're going to reconcile ourselves with the heavens, or from a secular point of view, reconcile ourselves with life. Again, whether we call it Elohim, God, the source of nature, or nature, life. We're going to reconcile ourselves with the heavens, with life, and continue living and not fall into a deep depression or despair. So that this is, I think, the main theme of the Kaddish. And with that, I'll conclude this video then on death and mourning. Thank you.